"I will not marry you," she said. The Duke of Castlereigh smiled. "You already have. I have told this story at 3 dinner tables and been contradicted each time by people who were not there. So let me set the record straight, since I am the only witness who survived the whole of it without losing my composure, though I confess it was a near thing. My name is Edmund Hartley. I have been Castlereigh's closest friend since we were 7 years old when he knocked me down in the stable yard for telling him his horse was lame. He was right. The horse was fine. I have spent the intervening years learning when to defer to his judgment, and when, on the rarest of occasions, he is wrong and will acknowledge it only privately and never with an apology. This is the story of the one time he was entirely right, and still nearly lost everything, by being insufferably calm about it. It began with a solicitor's error, or rather, not an error at all, though for 3 weeks Castlereigh was content to let Miss Honoria Pemberton believe it was. Her uncle, Gerald Pemberton, was a man of considerable debts and considerable cowardice, who had for 2 years managed to keep one fact from his niece, that he had signed a betrothal agreement on her behalf when she was 19, in exchange for the settlement of those debts, with the late Duke of Castlereigh, Archer's father. The agreement named Honoria Pemberton as the intended bride of the heir. It bore her uncle's legal seal. It had been filed with the county solicitor. It was, in a word, binding. Archer learned of it 3 days before his 30th birthday, when his own solicitor placed the document on his desk and said, with the careful blankness of a man delivering complicated news, "Your Grace, it appears you are, by the terms of your late father's agreement, already engaged." Archer read it twice. He poured himself a glass of claret. He said, "Tell me about her." He did not say, "Find a way to dissolve it." He did not say, "Send her a settlement and my regrets." He said, "Tell me about her," which, as I have since told him more than once, was the moment I knew it was over for him, though it took him rather longer to admit it than it should have. I met Honoria Pemberton before Archer did. He sent me ahead to Pemberton Grange on the grounds that I was less alarming, which was flattering only if one had never met me. The truth was that he wanted someone to observe her before he walked into what he privately suspected was either a catastrophe or the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he was not sure he could trust his own judgment on which. I arrived at Pemberton Grange on a Tuesday afternoon in October, was shown into a drawing room that smelled faintly of old roses and dog, and waited 12 minutes before the door opened. She came in carrying a letter she had evidently been writing, set it face down on the side table with the automatic precision of someone accustomed to sudden interruptions, and looked at me with the clearest gray eyes I have encountered in 30 years of social life. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "I assume you have come to tell me something I will not wish to hear." I said carefully, "I have come to make an introduction, Miss Pemberton." "On behalf of whom?" "The Duke of Castlereigh." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then she sat down, not because she was surprised, but because she had apparently decided we were going to have a long conversation, and she preferred to be comfortable during it. "He knows," she said. "It was not a question. He has known for 9 days. She looked at her hands in her lap, "And he has not dissolved it." "He has not." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, with a lightness so precise it could only have been manufactured in the 48 hours since her uncle had finally, shamefully told her, "Well, he must be either desperate or mad." I said because it was true and I thought she deserved one honest thing. "He is neither, as it happens. He is simply very patient." She looked at me then with an expression I could not quite name, not contempt, not hope, not fear. Something more complicated than any of those. She said, "Tell the Duke of Castlereigh that I will receive him on Thursday. And tell him also," she paused, and for just a moment the composure slipped, and underneath it I saw something fierce and a little frightened. "Tell him that I am not property, Mr. Hartley, regardless of what a piece of paper says." I told him exactly that. He listened without expression and said, "Good, Thursday then." I said, "Archer, she's going to be difficult." He said, "Yes." I said, "That does not worry you." He said, "Edmund, I have been looking for someone difficult for 15 years. Thursday arrived with October rain and an east wind that set the Pemberton Grange windows rattling. I accompanied Archer in the carriage and spent the journey watching him, which was not a thing I often attempted since he found it unnerving and told me so. But I had formed the suspicion, since reading the solicitor's document myself, that Archer had made up his mind in some deep and unannounced way, and I wanted to see whether I was right. He was dressed more carefully than usual. That was all I needed. We were shown into the drawing room, the same old roses, the same dog smell, a fire now burning against the cold, and we waited perhaps 3 minutes before she came. She was taller than I had remembered, or perhaps merely carrying herself differently. She wore gray, which I suspect was deliberate, as though she had decided to give the occasion no color it had not earned. She crossed to us without hurrying, gave Archer the kind of curtsy that is exactly correct and carries no warmth whatsoever, and said, "Your Grace." He said, "Miss Pemberton." She looked at him for 3 seconds, the same clear assessment she had given me, and then said, "Shall we dispense with the pleasantries? I understand we are, by certain legal instruments, betrothed." Archer said with perfect composure, "Married actually." She blinked. It was the first unguarded thing I saw her do. "I beg your pardon." "Married," he said again, with the same unbothered calm he used when correcting a miscalculation at cards. "Your uncle signed not only the betrothal agreement but a proxy marriage consent, which, as I understand it, and Mr. Farrow has been quite thorough, is binding under the existing statute since you were of age, and the consent was filed before the Act's repeal. You are by law the Duchess of Castlereigh. You have been for 7 years." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. I have heard silence at funerals and silence at financial ruin and silence after very bad news at sea. This was different from all of them. This was the silence of a woman deciding, very rapidly, what she was going to do next. What she did was cross to the window, stand with her back to us for a count of perhaps 10, and then turn around. Her voice was entirely level. "I will not accept this," she said. Archer said, "I'm afraid the statute doesn't require your acceptance." "Then I will fight it." "On what grounds?" She looked at him with something that was beginning to approach real fury, which she was managing with extraordinary precision. "On every ground available to a woman whose consent was never sought." He said, and this is the moment I maintain lost him whatever high ground he might have occupied, "Your consent was not required under the Act. But your comfort is, as it happens, rather important to me, which is why I am here in person rather than sending a notice through Mr. Farrow." She stared at him. "My comfort? Yes. You have informed me that I have been your wife for 7 years without my knowledge, and you have come in person to assure me of my comfort." He said, with what I can only describe as infuriating gentleness, "Would you have preferred the notice through Farrow?" There was another silence. Then she said with great deliberateness, "I will not marry you, Your Grace." And Archer, in the voice of a man who has found the thing he has been looking for, and is in no hurry whatsoever, smiled just slightly and said, "You already have." What followed was 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Honoria Pemberton not accepting any of it, which meant 3 weeks of Archer declining to be refused, which in practice meant a great deal of correspondence, 2 formal visits, and 1 extraordinary afternoon in the Pemberton Grange garden in which she informed him of her precise objections to the arrangement in what I am told was a 20-minute speech of considerable force and intelligence, and he listened to every word without interruption, and then said, "You are entirely right. I am asking you to accept a situation you did not choose, created by 2 men who had no business making it. I cannot undo the legal circumstance. But I am asking, not informing, not insisting, whether you will let me try to make it something you would have chosen." She told me about it herself later. She said she had not expected that. She said she had prepared 15 more arguments and had none of them left once he said it. She said, and this is the part of the story I most enjoy, "He was so damnably calm, Mr. Hartley. I wanted to be furious and he wouldn't let me." I said, "He has always been like that. I have found it useful to pick one's moment and simply wait him out." She said, "How long does that take?" I said, "In my experience, the better part of a lifetime." She laughed then. Properly, not politely, not carefully, but the way a person laughs when they have been holding their breath for a long time, and something unexpected gives them permission to breathe again. The 4th visit was different. I was not present, so I have the account third hand, from Castlereigh's valet, who overheard it from the garden path, which I think tells you something about how it went. She had been walking in the garden. The roses were finished by November, but the grounds at Pemberton Grange ran to a long stone path along the east wall, and she apparently walked it when she was thinking. Archer arrived earlier than expected and found her there without the buffer of a drawing room or a formal announcement, which I suspect was exactly what he intended. The valet says they walked together for a quarter of an hour without speaking much. The east wind was still running. The leaves were off the chestnuts. At the far end of the path, she stopped and looked out over the field, and he stopped beside her, and she said, without turning, "I think I have been angry on behalf of a version of this. I kept imagining that was worse than it is." He said, "I know." She said, "That is a very annoying thing to say." He said, "Yes, I'm sorry." She was quiet a moment. Then, "If I were to agree, if I were to come to Castlereigh Hall as myself, not as a piece of a legal document, what would that look like?" He said, "It would look however you wished it to look." She turned to look at him then. The valet, who is a romantic of the first order and will be getting a very fine Christmas box this year, says she stood looking at him for rather a long time, the way one looks at something one is deciding whether to trust. Then she said, "You could have simply sent the notice through Pharaoh." He said, "Yes." "Why didn't you?" A long pause. Archer, as I mentioned, is not a man of speeches. He is a man of single, precise sentences, delivered only when he is certain of them. He said, "Because I had read a letter you wrote to your solicitor contesting the arrangement, and in it you said, I will not quote it, you said something about what you were worth, and what you had always been told you were worth, and what you believed those to be quite different things. And I thought that whichever way this resolved, that woman deserved to be spoken to rather than corresponded at." She was quiet for a long time. The wind came off the field. The bare chestnuts rattled. She said, "You read my letter." He said, "Pharaoh showed it to me. I should have told you sooner." She said, "You should have." He said, "Yes, I am sorry for that too." The fifth visit I was present for. It was a Sunday. She had come to Castlereigh Hall her first time, her own choosing, with her maid and a small trunk, under the understood arrangement that she was visiting as a guest, not moving in as a duchess. Archer had agreed to those terms without a word of protest, which I had told him privately was the right call, and he had said, "I know, Edmund," in a way that meant he had already decided before I said anything. She walked through the hall with the composed attention of someone learning a place they might have to live in. She asked questions about the estate, the tenants, a particular portrait she stopped in front of for a long time. She was warm with the housekeeper and formal with the rest of the staff, and said nothing about being the Duchess, which I noticed the staff found very right. Archer walked beside her. He did not perform. He answered what she asked and showed her what she wanted and let the house speak for itself. At dinner, the three of us, quietly, she talked about the letter she had written to Pharaoh, which she had apparently thought he didn't know about, and then laughed when he told her he'd read it months ago, and then said, "Is there anything else I've written that you've read?" And he said, "No," and she said, "I believe you, which is surprising," and he said, "Why surprising?" And she said, "Because I haven't believed anything to do with this arrangement until quite recently." He said, "What changed?" She picked up her wine glass and looked at it and put it down and said, "You were very patient, and patience is the thing I trusted least because it can be a performance. But you were patient even about the things I didn't ask you to be patient about." "I noticed that." He said, "I noticed you noticing." She shook her head, but she was smiling. In the end, it was not a grand scene. There was no announcement before a ballroom, no cruel society humbled in a candlelit reveal. The Duchess of Castlereigh simply began to appear at her husband's side on estate business, at the neighboring families' tables, in the village in November with the housekeeper, quietly, with the unhurried assurance of a woman who had made up her mind and did not require the world's applause for it. But there was one moment. December, the quarterly tenants gathering at Castlereigh Hall. Half the county gentry were there, and not all of them friendly. There had been talk, as there always is talk, about the unusual circumstance of the Duke's sudden marriage, about the nobody wife, about the proxy document, about what exactly was the arrangement there. The local ladies who had hoped for something better for their daughters and had not been discreet about it were present in force. Honoria walked in beside Archer, and I watched the room calculate the situation. The particular kind of silence that falls when a room decides to be unfriendly descended, and I saw one or two of the crueler faces begin to arrange themselves into the expressions that precede cutting remarks. And Archer, who was, I cannot stress enough, a man of very few public gestures, did something he had, to my knowledge, never done in a gathering of this kind. He stopped in the middle of the hall and turned to face her, and in a voice that was quiet but carried precisely as far as the nearest clutch of those unfriendly faces, he said, "I have been trying to tell you something for 3 weeks that I managed to get wrong every time I tried. I think you should hear it before we go in." She looked at him. "What is it?" He said, "That I am glad. Of the document and the circumstances and the absurdity of the whole thing and the 3 weeks of being refused and the letter to Pharaoh and November in the garden. I am glad of all of it because it brought me to you, and I had spent 30 years not finding you, and I think that should be said in front of witnesses." The hall was entirely still. She looked at him for a long moment. I could see her deciding, again, whether to fight it, that reflex of a woman who had learned very young not to trust what was offered to her. Then she said, "You could have waited until we were inside." He said, "I have been patient. I am done waiting." She took his arm. She looked briefly with perfect composure at the unfriendly faces and past them and forward. "Then let's go in," she said. They did. I tell it that way not because it is the most dramatic version. I was present for more dramatic versions of things that summer, but because it is the truest. She was not a woman who needed saving. She was not a woman who needed a ballroom full of witnesses to her vindication. She was a woman who needed one person to tell the truth about what she was worth, and to mean it, and to wait as long as it took for her to believe it. The Duke of Castlereigh is not a sentimental man, but I have heard him, once, when he thought he was alone in the library, say her name to no one in particular, the way a man says something he is still not quite accustomed to owning. He said it the way a man says the name of the thing he almost missed.